going to turn on the recording. Okay, there we go. Okay, well, thank you all for joining today. We're going to be talking about Ping Proud. So globally, in many countries, June is a month where people celebrate and acknowledge the LGBT plus community. And Ping, we have an employee support group. No, it's ERG, an employee resource group that is dedicated to Pride. And all around the world, different Ping offices are having all sorts of different activities. And so, by the way, if you're interested in this topic and you want more, you can join the Slack channel for Ping Proud. And like I said, all around the world, all month, there's going to be all sorts of different activities. And, no matter where you stand on this stuff, it's at least interesting. And so I encourage you, feel free to join that, participate in not just events here, but all around the world as part of being a Identian, a Ping Identian. But okay, let's kick off for today. I wanted to start with a couple of caveats. Okay, so first, it's okay if you have come today and you're actually anti-LGBT plus, or if you're pro-LGBT plus, or if you have no idea and you're not really sure where you stand on the spectrum. Actually, today is going to be a super safe space for everyone. We're not going to discuss rights or wrongs or morality or ethics or any of that stuff. Instead, week one of Pride is really just awareness. It's making sure that we can get on the same page about terms, what LGBT plus actually means. Um, but we're not talking about, right or wrong, good or bad. So this should be a safe place no matter where you're coming from. I would like this to be a safe space for all of you. The second thing is I need to confess here that I'm actually a heterosexual male. I identify as a man and I present as a man, which is essentially as far from LGBT plus as anyone can get. So it's a bit weird for me to be kicking off Pride Month, but I've actually been an ally probably for longer than some of you on the call have even been alive. So I hope that you'll forgive my biases today. I will have them. We all have biases. And I hope you'll forgive when I represent bias. And next week, I promise that we've got a panel with folks who are legitimately within the LGBT plus community coming from Singapore. So you'll get that perspective too. So if I can't deliver, unbiased and only ally view next week, or next week should be better. Um, so I wanted to talk today really about terms because there's lots of it's actually a confusing topic, and we don't necessarily ever have a chance to sit down and think through ideas about gender and sexuality. We don't necessarily make time for that, and so we often get our views from incomplete kind of discussions. And what I want to do in the next probably 30 minutes is just kind of talk through how um, folks in the academic and scientific community are thinking about this, just to give a perspective. But like I said, we're not going to talk at all about is it good or is it bad. That's not part of this conversation. So I wanted to start with the first topic, or the first pillar of LGBT community, which is just biological sex, which is how the body is built. And it's actually made up of several variables. So obviously, you got a reproductive system and you have, you have reproductive organs. And generally speaking, for most of human history, because we haven't known anything about from a medical perspective other than what we can basically see, that's sort of been how people understand biological sex is, do you have a male genitalia or female genitalia, right? More recently, over the last 100 years, as science has kind of understood chromosomes and hormones, our sense of biological self has kind of expanded. So, for example, today you can have individuals that have XX chromosomes or XY chromosomes, but you can also have different variations of those, so that the sense of male versus female from a chromosomal perspective, like visually, you may say, oh, this is a male, this is a female, but inside it's not necessarily as clear cut. Similarly, a lot of what produces biological sex happens after you're born, after the baby has differentiated to one reproductive system or another. Hormones play a huge amount in how the body ultimately begins to express biological sex. So, for example, how much testosterone do you produce versus how much estrogen you produce? And those differences can be quite profound. And in fact, they can be affected even by environmental factors, having, nothing to do with genetics, literally in what kind of environments that you grow up in. And so what we find is that biological sex is more complicated than we've understood it for most of human history, but it's still, there's not that many variables. And like, the difference in chromosomes, that's a pretty rare case, right? So that doesn't create a community of millions of people, but it is important from a scientific perspective on defining how do you define biological sex. So, like I mentioned, historically, Western culture has sort of appreciated two biological sexes, male and female, right? And that's oftentimes just simply because that's all we could see. But in reality, we kind of know now that that's probably too simplistic of a way to differentiate. I mean, only based on the reproductive systems. So I mentioned before, variations beyond XX and XY chromosomes. You can have X0 or you can have XXY, and these are not common, but they do exist, and they kind of break our ability to easily define what biological sex is. And like I mentioned, also variation of production of sex hormones, estrogen and testosterone. And note, by the way, that across the diversity of all people, the how much one produces estrogen and testosterone varies dramatically. So you can actually have in the bell curve of humanity, you can have males that have higher estrogen levels than some females do, and vice versa for testosterone. So once we start talking about how the hormones are impacting the representation or the expression of biological sex, it gets really complicated because that diversity in hormones and chemicals is massive. Way more obviously than simply does the person have male or female genitalia. So as a result, it's probably more correct to say that biological sex sits on a spectrum. And you've got males on one side and you've got females on the other. And there's a category which the community calls intersex, which is somewhere in between. And I think that if we just look at reproductive systems, it's most of the bell curve falls at the two ends. But once we start considering the impact of sex hormones on biological sex, that gets much more complicated, and the spectrum becomes much more of a statistical bell curve, where very few people are actually 100% on one side or the other. It becomes a spectrum. So let's now look at the second category, which is gender identity. And gender identity is a tough one because it's not as obvious as biological sex. Gender identity is defined as how you see yourself. How do you identify? Do you see yourself as a man or a woman? And I use the term man and woman here differently from male and female because gender identification isn't comparing the same things as biological sex. Biological sex is the reproductive systems, chromosomes, and hormones, which you just talked about. Gender identity is much more loose. It's actually a social, cultural context. There's no biology to whether you see yourself as a man or a woman. That there's no science behind it. It's really psychology, it's anthropology. It's how your social, cultural context is defined and how you feel about your behavior. So gender is defined as sort of shared expectations about how men and women are supposed to behave, how they're supposed to dress, play, socialize, and interact, right? That's what gender is. And this supposed to behave means that it's really tied to a culture. And we know, certainly in Southeast Asia, we know that we have examples, for example, of third sex in Thailand. So third sex in Thailand, interestingly, they define trans women, which is a biological male who identifies as a woman. That's a trans woman. And in Thailand, it's so embedded into the core culture that actually, if you know in Thailand, if you're speaking to someone, you might say Sawati Kap if you're a man, and you might say Sawati Ka if you're a woman. Well, if you're a third gender, there's actually a different pronoun at the end, which is Sawati Ma. right? So even down to the language, we have this idea of third gender in Thailand. Sometimes when you look back at history, I think what you find is that actually Southeast Asia has always had a history of at least three genders. It wasn't until colonization where the European powers sort of pushed a certain viewpoint, legal, philosophical, religious viewpoint onto the colonized countries that we actually moved away. And Thailand, of course, was the has a distinction of never having been colonized, and I think that's why you see sort of a more authentic or a more localized sense of what gender means, and not a Western sense, but a regional sense. But the key here is that you want, as you're thinking about this stuff, you want to differentiate between is it a male or a female, or is it a man or a woman? Because male and female is biological and physical, and man and woman is very intellectual. It's in the brain, it's in the heart, it's in the spirit, in the soul. It's not necessarily aligned to biology. Um, Now, obviously, just like biological sex, gender identity also has two extremes. On the one hand, you have something called cis, and on the other hand, you have something called trans. So if someone is cis, it means that their gender identity and their biological sex are the same, right? They're aligned. So a biological male, so let's say I'm a biological male and I identify with the definition of man in the society that I'm in. Um, that means I'm cis. So I'm cis, right? That I am a biological male and I identify as a man in both Singapore as well as in the US, as well as anywhere that I am so far. So I'm cis. But if you're trans, it means that your biological sex is the opposite of your gender identity. So in that case, you'd be a biological male, but you truly feel like how society defines a woman, that's how I feel about myself. So maybe I find boys' clothes totally uncomfortable to wear, and wearing a cute dress makes me feel myself. Or the opposite. Next week, one of our panelists can tell you a story about when she was at MGS, and she wanted to, she saw herself in male presentation, male gender, and so she really didn't want to wear a dress. And so I'm sure she'll share that story about fighting MGS over how you, what uniform you were allowed to wear. So, okay, so of course, just with biological sex, the story is not as simple as cis versus trans. In the great diverse bell curve of humanity, there's actually a huge variation between these two poles, which in the community is called non-binary. So in this case, you have many individuals who either feel as if one, they're somewhere in between the two ends of the spectrum. Sometimes they feel feminine, sometimes they feel like a woman, sometimes they feel like a man. They're somewhere in between. Um, Sometimes another way is that they might simply reject the idea of gender entirely. They say, I don't, this is a social construct. It doesn't apply to me. I think the whole spectrum is being dumped on me and it's just not who I am, right? So sometimes it can be just, it's a rejection. Non-binary just means I reject the concept of binary. Um, so I identify with, a man or a woman as defined by society, or something in between man or woman, or neither man or woman, right? So all of these things are possible. And to make matters more complicated, my identity can change over time in different social cultural contexts, and the very definition of man and woman also changes over time with society. I hear stories, my wife tells me stories about Singapore in the 60s when you could not have long hair. If you were a traveler coming in from Australia or the US and you had long hippie hair, it was just simply considered a no-go in Singapore. And if you want to come in, you got to cut, if you're a man, you got to cut your hair because men have short hair, right? But that changes over time. What society thinks is okay actually constantly changes. So the definition of man and woman in gender roles is very fluid, right? And like I said, you yourself in your life could change how you feel. We know about the case of Bruce Jenner, and people make changes and choices throughout their lives, and those are different when you're in your teens and when you're in your 60s. So we have to understand that the spectrum, if you will, is very fluid. And like as with biological sex, probably it is its own form of bell curve, and not necessarily everybody fits on the two polar opposites. It might be rare that somebody is truly, I am only a man, or I see myself only as a woman. Actually, probably everybody has a little bit of leeway either in either direction. Okay, so the third one to look at is gender expression, right? So this is not necessarily what you believe, that how you see yourself. This is how you want everybody else to see you, right? So this is how you behave in society, not necessarily what you think in your own mind. So regardless of our biological sex and regardless of how we identify inside, we all behave externally in the context of, again, social and cultural expectations about gender. And again, there's sort of these two archetypes. There's masculine and there's feminine. So society will assume that there's a correlation between biological sex, gender identity, and gender expression. So society considers it normal for a biological male to identify as a man and behave in a masculine way, and for a biological female to identify as a woman and behave in a feminine way. That's sort of the societal expectation. But again, the real world is not as simplistic as that, right? So when we think about the spectrum, we can put androgyny in the middle, right? And androgyny is the degree to which your gender expression contradicts your biological sense, though not necessarily your gender identity, right? So, for example, you could be a biological female, you identify as a woman, but you just like to wear jeans, sneakers, and have a buzz cut hairstyle. And you like to lift free weights and drink beer and watch English Premier League, right? So you just you just like to present yourself as more androgynous. So your level of androgyny on the spectrum of gender expression depends on how much your behavior contradicts with what society thinks how your biological sex should behave. Okay, so but again, that's a spectrum. So everybody has kind of different preferences about how they want to show their internal beliefs to the outside world, and biological sex, gender expression, and gen and then uh, yeah, how you express outside, those all can be different. Okay, so the last one we want to cover is sexual orientation, which is essentially who are you sexually attracted to, or who do you feel romantic love for? I did this with my kids, the same presentation with my kids, and my daughter Lauren, who is on the LGBT in the LGBT community, did give me feedback, which was like, actually, who you're attracted to and who you feel romantic love for need to be different spectrums, because you can be sexually attracted, you could be a man sexually attracted to a man, but you still feel romantic love for a woman. That's possible, right? So I'm not going to do that in this talk. I probably should, because I should tell Lauren, hey, I made changes, but okay, at least I talked about it. So we're going to look now just at sexual orientation and kind of lump those sex and love together. So, oh, another bipolar mental model, right? So humans really like black and whites. So we call individuals straight if they're attracted to individuals of the opposite biological sex, completely ignoring the idea of intersex, right? And by the way, completely ignoring gender and gender expression. And then gay people are equivalently defined as those who are sexually attracted to individuals of the same biological sex. So I'm straight if I am a biological male that is sexually attracted to females. That's what's considered straight from a definition perspective. Um, however, some people, unfortunately, or not unfortunately, some people are sexually attracted to both biological males and biological females, perhaps equally, or perhaps with some degree of preference. Like they like men generally, but sometimes they like women, right? Or they might be asexual. They might not be sexually attracted to anyone at all. Right. And historically, we call this bisexual. And I think in the modern day, bisexuality has now been redefined, and they call it pan or queer or polysexual or pansensual. But the idea is they want to move away from, like, bisexual still is supporting this idea of bipolar or two sides, right? And so they want to get rid of this idea of bi and just say, hey, listen, it's just a complete spectrum of all sorts of different preferences. And so it's not just two sides. Okay, so together, we kind of have a model that we can use to understand real people in real context without falling prey to media talking points. Okay, that's what I really want to just communicate how limited the media talking points are when you really want to appreciate the diversity of humans, real humans living their real lives with their biology and their beliefs and their feelings and everything else. So let's just see how you might use this. So for example, if you see here, the red circle represents the person I'm going to talk about. So this is a biological male who identifies as a man, acts in a masculine way, and is sexually attracted to women. Okay? Can you imagine people like that? Do you know people like that? Of course you do, right? That's the norm. That's the super cis model, right? So of course you know people like that in the real world. How about a biological male who identifies as a man, acts in a feminine way, but is sexually attracted to women still? Do you know people like that? Of course you do. There's loads of people like that in Singapore. How about biological females who identify as a man, they act pretty masculine, and they're attracted to women. Can you imagine people like that? I think you do. We'll certainly meet one of those next week in the panel discussion, right? So wherever you are in the world, you should be able to recognize this type of a person. And how about a biological female that has female reproductive systems but produces more testosterone than the average female, who identifies mostly as a woman, but not entirely, and who expresses themselves mostly in a feminine way and who is attracted to men, though if Billie Eilish were offering, she wouldn't kick her out of bed for eating crackers, right? And maybe had some experimentation in college with other females. Do you know people like that? Of course you do, right? So in real life, people fall across the spectrum with the full level of diversity. It is simply not uh, it's not a good enough description to simply think two sides. It doesn't describe real people in their real worlds. And so if you want to appreciate and understand the experiences of others and how others are wanting to live their life, it's important to allow for the spectrum and think across all four different types: biological, sex, gender expression, and sexuality. To really understand a person, you need to understand all of these things. Yeah, so I think the point for me is that if we take away philosophical and religious ideas of good and bad, and we just look at what exists in nature, then everyone here in all of these categories is normal. You may disagree with how they're living their life or how they are, but it's important at least to acknowledge that there is this great diversity of humanity. And the idea of normal is not super effective, right? It's not the best way to understand all of these things. Okay, so I just want to close out with a couple of thoughts. And Jace, actually, hey Jolene, can I oh Jolene dropped, I think. Okay, let me ask JC. JC, can I use you for a public game? Do I have permission?
Sure. Go ahead.
Okay. So my first question, JC, is are you Chinese? And don't answer the question. Just let the question hang in the air for a minute. Like, how do you feel about that, right? Think about that question. Are you Chinese? Okay. Now let me ask a different question. Again, don't answer the question, but JC, are you gay? So don't answer the question. Just let the question hang in the air a little bit. How do you feel inside? Everybody in the audience, not just JC, but everybody, how do you feel about those two questions? It wasn't the same, right? The first question was a nothing question. I don't think JC would have felt anything in particular. It was like, yes, I come from Chinese background, let's say, right? Now there may be more nuance that I'm not representing here, but I think when the question is asked, it doesn't feel bad. The question about are you gay? That's a really hard one. That kind of comes with a certain level of anxiety, right? If you're gay, it comes with a certain type of anxiety. If you're not gay, it comes with a certain type of anxiety. And then for everybody in the audience, I expect most of you sort of were a little bit uncomfortable. And thank goodness HR isn't in the room because they would definitely not have liked that question, right? So as you're thinking about it, note that this question, are you gay, comes with built-in anxiety. Now imagine that you're actually part of the LGBT community, LGBT plus community. And imagine that you have to live your life all day, every day with this low level and sometimes high level thread of anxiety constantly with you, right? Because all throughout the day, there can be moments where the question in different forms comes up, right? And imagine that you're kind of you have to live your whole life with that anxiety in you constantly. Now, different people have learned to deal with that anxiety differently, right? So some people are okay with it, but but it's there, right? You're always having this low level anxiety, and that's going to come with its own chemicals in the body, right? That are not good for health and for happiness and all of the rest of it. And I'll tell you a kind of an interesting thing. You might think, oh, that doesn't really come up, but I'll tell you, it comes up all the time. And sometimes we call these things microaggressions, even if it doesn't mean that the other person is doesn't like you or has making value judgments or anything else, but we call it microaggressions. And I'll give you a specific example from yesterday, right? So as you most of you guys know, I'm in Thailand this week and I'm doing biz dev and partner development with Joe. And Joe and I were having coffee while we were waiting for Bangkok Bank meeting. And we were just chit-chatting about life. And then the topic of my wife came up. And then Joe said, is she Singaporean? Right? And that's an interesting one, right? Because what if he doesn't know, what if I were LGBT community and my wife was a man, right? How do I respond to Joe in that moment? Do I just play the game and say, "Oh yeah, she's Singaporean." And let's forget about it. Let's just move on, right? Or do I say I try to maybe fix the wording a bit and say, "Oh, my partner is Singaporean." But that also can sometimes come with a bit of awkwardness and anxiety as well when you answer like that. Or do I like say, "Hey, hey, hey, wait, my wife is a man." Like, let's be straight up about this. So where you get how do you reply? Whatever the case, there's that anxiety there, right? There's always going to be that anxiety there. And I think that one of the things that we can do when we talk about having an inclusive culture at Ping, one of the things that we can do is just watch ourselves and make sure that as we're interacting with other identities, that we're thoughtful about our own biases and microaggressions, and we don't put other people in situations where their anxiety grows. Like that's one thing that you can consider. And by the way, I've been in this community, I've been an ally probably for 30 years, okay? And I screw up all the time as a leader. I make microaggressions and I say non-inclusive things all the time. So I'm not picking on Joe, I'm not picking on JC. No, no, no. This is a hard thing, right? These are ideas and mental models that have been drilled into us all our lives by our societies, and they're not easy to change. And I think don't hold yourself to such a high bar that you can't make mistakes from time to time and you can't recover. Just be aware. Just be aware of the biases that you have. Try to see them happening in action and then pivot. Maybe pivot in the moment. I could say, hey Joe, and maybe I will. I probably should have. I probably should have said, hey, that was a maybe a non-inclusive way to frame that question. And it doesn't mean that I don't love you still as a colleague and we're friends and everything is good. But hey, imagine that I was LGBT, how that would affect me. And so that's something that everybody here can work on. Don't expect that you're going to be successful all the time because you won't be. It is hard and you never become a true proper ally. You just are always on a journey towards that. And all you can do is try to be aware, think about the nuances of the definitions I've given you today, and do your best to make Ping welcoming and safe for everybody. And even not just LGBT plus, but different races, different age groups, different uh, uh, sexes, different anything about differences is I think our goal can be just we want to make our culture welcoming, regardless of what you believe from good or bad. At least let's make this a place where humans feel welcomed. Um, and if I can maybe leave you with a personal goal around LGBT plus, um, I would love to find myself in a world where the human race has kind of moved to a place where there's simply no nuance attached to the question, are you gay? It's like, are you Chinese? There's, you don't feel weird or awkward about it. It's just part of normal, right? It's just boring. I actually would love a world that was just boring around gender and sexuality and all the rest of it. There's nothing anxiety driven around it. It's just something that exists in life and in people, and then we just get on with it. It doesn't affect anything. And we're not there. We're not there as a human race, and we have a lot of room to go towards that, and hopefully we will. Um, but that's where personally, I would love to see that the world gets there. And I think that we would get millions of people with happier lives if we could get to that. Okay, so that's all I had from a sharing perspective. I'm gonna stop the recording now. Pause.